In the final moments of World War II, as victory seemed certain, Britain faced a terrifying new reality. It wasn't the threat of invasion or bombs, but a financial apocalypse. The nation was utterly broke, and the bill for its survival was about to come due, presented by its closest ally, the United States. This is the story of how the U.S., in a masterstroke of economic statecraft, dismantled the British Empire and inherited its global dominance, all through a series of ruthless negotiations that America's own negotiator called one of the most difficult tasks of his life. Let's rewind to 1940. Britain stands alone against the Axis powers. Winston Churchill makes a desperate appeal to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The message is simple. We need weapons, planes, and ships. But we've run out of cash. Roosevelt, understanding that a British defeat would be a disaster for America, devises a clever plan. The Lend-Lease Act. The idea was brilliant in its simplicity. America would lend or lease war materials to its allies, deferring payment until after the war. Roosevelt famously compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house is on fire. You don't ask for payment then and there. You just want your hose back after the fire is out. This garden hose turned out to be a fire hose of military aid, totaling over $50 billion worth of goods. That's nearly $700 billion in today's money. Britain was the largest recipient, getting over $31 billion in aid. This lifeline kept Britain in the fight. Its factories could focus on building Spitfires and tanks, while American ships brought the food, oil, and raw materials needed to keep the country running. Without Lend-Lease, Britain would have likely been forced to negotiate with Germany, changing the course of history forever. It was an act of generosity, yes, but one with some very sharp strings attached. The war ends. The world celebrates. But in London, the mood is grim. The very day Japan surrenders, the new American president, Harry Truman, abruptly terminates Lend-Lease. The tab is turned off, instantly. For Britain, it's a catastrophe. The country had geared its entire economy around this American aid. Suddenly, it was cut off. Ships already on their way to Britain were literally turned around in the middle of the ocean, unless the British government could pay for their cargo in cash. But Britain had no cash. The war had cost the country a quarter of its national wealth. It had sold off its overseas investments, liquidated its gold reserves, and taken on massive debts. The nation was on the brink of a financial Dunkirk, as the famed economist John Maynard Keynes put it. So, Keynes, Britain's most brilliant economic mind, was sent to Washington, D.C. in September 1945. His mission, to secure a lifeline. He initially hoped for a grant, a gift, recognizing Britain's immense sacrifice. After all, Britain had held the line while America prepared for war. Surely, its closest ally would help it get back on its feet. He was about to get a rude awakening. The Americans were not in a giving mood. They saw an opportunity. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, the Secretary of the Treasury, had a different agenda. They weren't interested in grants. They were offering a loan, and a loan with incredibly harsh conditions. The Americans had a name for their demands. The considerations. It sounded harmless, but it was a list of requirements designed to break the back of the British Empire. The primary target was a system called the Sterling Area. This was a trading bloc of countries, mostly from the British Empire. They used the pound sterling for international trade and held their reserves in London. This system gave British businesses a huge advantage, effectively shutting American companies out of a massive global market. America wanted and this was their chance to kick the door down. The negotiations were brutal. Keynes, already in frail health, was shocked by the American stance. He described the American negotiators as holding all the cards and playing them with a poker-faced skill. The U.S. demanded that Britain dismantle the sterling area. They insisted that the pound sterling be made freely convertible into U.S. dollars within 1 year. This meant anyone, anywhere, holding pounds could exchange them for dollars. Given that the world was desperate for American goods and the dollar was the strongest currency, this would trigger a massive run on Britain's already depleted reserves. It was a condition designed to shatter Britain's economic influence. Another key demand was the end of imperial preference, a system of low tariffs for trade within the British Empire. This system had been a cornerstone of imperial policy for decades, binding the colonies and dominions to Britain. The Americans wanted it gone, opening up these protected markets to free competition competition that American industry, untouched by war, was perfectly positioned to win. In essence, the United States was demanding that Britain voluntarily give up the economic pillars that held its empire together in exchange for a loan. It was a choice between immediate bankruptcy and the slow, managed decline of its global power. Keynes fought valiantly. He argued, pleaded, and warned that these harsh terms would cripple Britain and destabilize the post-war world. He told the Americans they were picking the eyes out of the British Empire. But the Americans wouldn't budge. They knew Britain was desperate. They had no other options. The mood in Washington was clear. The American public was tired of footing the bill for Europe and wanted to see a return on their investment. After weeks of grueling talks, a broken and exhausted Keynes had to accept the terms. Britain would get a loan of $3.75 billion, but at a cost. The price was the empire. The loan agreement, signed in late 1945, was a death warrant for British global supremacy. Britain had to agree to end the sterling area's restrictions and make the pound convertible. When they tried to do so in 1947, the result was exactly what Keynes had predicted: a catastrophic run on the pound. The convertibility experiment had to be suspended in just 5 weeks, but not before it had drained a huge portion of the American loan. The economic chaos that followed accelerated the push for independence across the empire. Colonies like India, seeing Britain's weakness, pushed harder for their freedom, which they achieved just 2 years later. The Suez Crisis in 1956 was the final nail in the coffin. When Britain invaded Egypt, the U.S. used its financial power, threatening to sell off its holdings of pound sterling and collapse the British economy, to force a humiliating withdrawal. The message was clear. Britain was no longer a superpower. The United States was now in charge. The Anglo-American loan was finally paid off in 2006, 61 years after it was signed. For over 6 decades, British taxpayers were paying for the very deal that dismantled their country's empire. It's a stark reminder that in geopolitics, there are no permanent friends, only permanent interests. The United States, under the guise of post-war aid, executed a brilliant and ruthless economic strategy. It leveraged Britain's wartime sacrifice to dismantle its main rival's empire, open up global markets for its own goods, and establish the US dollar as the world's dominant currency. The secret bill for World War II wasn't just about money, it was about power. And in paying it, Britain handed the torch of global leadership directly to the United States. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of hidden history interesting, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more stories like this. See you next time.